Ever get that feeling like, just too much?
Like too much about things that don't even really matter.
Yeah. Like all this information is kind of weighing you down, That's what we're looking at today.
Oh, interesting.
This idea of information, can it actually be a burden?
Okay.
We've got this really interesting Substack article. It's by the Appalachian Gorilla. It's called Being Burdened by Info.
Interesting. That is a good question. We always assume, right? Like more knowledge is always better.
Right.
But what if that's not actually true?
Yeah, that's exactly what this author is getting at. And they start off with this clever analogy about magicians. Like when you learn how a magic trick works, it kind of ruins the illusion, you know?
Totally. It's like that. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Exactly.
And it's not just magic tricks, right?
Right.
Think about like finding out your favorite band, like they lip sync all their concerts.
Oh, yeah.
Or that a charity you support is full of corruption.
Yeah, you just can't look at it the same way.
It changes your whole perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. Like sometimes ignorance really is bliss.
Yeah.
Has that ever happened to you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there are definitely things where it's like, I wish I didn't know that.
We'd love to hear your stories actually on social media.
Yeah, tell us about it.
But back to the article, the author argues this unseeing thing, it can happen on a much larger scale, too. Like when we get disillusioned with, the media or political systems.
Oh, for sure, for sure. The more you learn about, how these systems actually work behind the scenes,
right,
the less magical they seem.
Yeah.
And that can lead to a lot of disillusionment, even cynicism, I think,
Totally. And on a more personal level, this whole information overload thing, it ties into something we all kind of experience.
And that is
anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
The article talks about how our brains are wired to focus on, like, immediate threats, not global issues.
Right.
It's like knowing the crime rate in a city you've never even visited.
Right.
Doesn't actually help you in any way, but it might make you more anxious about the world in general.
Absolutely, yeah. For most of human history, survival, it depended on reacting to immediate dangers.
Yes.
Like, is there a predator lurking in the bushes?
Yeah.
Our brains, they weren't bombarded with news about things happening across the world.
Exactly. So maybe being constantly plugged into the 24/7 news cycle is actually working against our natural wiring, causing us to be anxious about things we can't even control.
Right.
That's where the author's idea of the need-to-know principle comes in.
Okay, so break that down for us. What does that mean?
So they're arguing that maybe we should be more selective about the information we consume.
Right.
It's not about like shutting ourselves off from the world completely.
Right.
But maybe focusing on information that is like directly relevant to our own lives.
It's interesting. So throughout history, information access, it's always been kind of controlled, right?
Right.
By whoever's in power. But now with the internet, we have access to everything.
Everything, yeah.
It's almost like we swung from one extreme to the other, haven't we?
Yeah. And maybe that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
This unrestricted access to information, maybe it's not as liberating as we thought. It certainly makes it harder to filter out what's truly important.
Right, right.
Now, to kind of illustrate this point, the author uses a pretty interesting analogy.
Okay.
Comparing human society to an ant colony.
An ant colony. Okay. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So what do ants have to do with information overload?
Yeah.
Well, think about it. In an ant colony, each ant has a very specific role.
Right.
And they only need to know information relevant to that task. Like the worker ants gathering food.
Yep.
They don't need to know about the queen's egg-laying schedule.
Right. They just got to focus on their job.
Right. So the author is suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we'd be less overwhelmed if we, too, focused on information relevant to our own lives and roles.
That's interesting, but wouldn't that kind of limit us?
Right, that's the question.
Limit our potential as individuals.
Exactly.
I mean, what about the freedom to explore ideas outside of our little boxes, right?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. The author acknowledges that there are definitely potential downsides to this whole analogy.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance between efficiency and individual agency.
But amidst all this serious discussion, the author throws in a little bit of humor.
Yeah, the rodent turd analogy.
Oh, yes. A little jarring, I know, but,
A little bit.
It makes the point. The point is, sometimes it's better not to know.
Yeah.
Do you really want to know how many rodent droppings are allowed in your cereal?
Probably not.
Probably not. And, maybe you don't need to know all the ins and outs of how the EPA works.
Right. As long as my water is clean.
Exactly, exactly. But I think this whole conversation, it ties into something much bigger than just rodent turds and government agencies.
Yeah.
It gets at that fundamental human question, that search for meaning.
Right. The author's getting at this idea that our awareness of our own mortality, it's what drives us to seek meaning, purpose in our lives.
It's a uniquely human experience.
Yeah.
We know that our time is limited, so we want to make it count.
That quote really stuck with me. We want to make our time count, but how do we do that when we're constantly just bombarded with information that pulls us in a million different directions?
Yeah, it's like all the noise is actually preventing us from finding what truly matters.
It is, and that's exactly the dilemma that the author poses. He uses this really powerful image, the tree of knowledge from the Bible, right?
Oh, wow.
To illustrate this whole struggle. Is ignorance bliss? Or is it better to know, even if that knowledge brings, pain and disillusionment?
That's a big one, isn't it?
It is. It's a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. For centuries.
And it's a question, actually, that we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Stay with us.
Definitely stick around. So we're back. And before the break, we were talking about, is ignorance bliss?
The age-old question, right?
It's like red pill or the blue pill,
Exactly. Would you rather live in the Matrix, enjoy a perfectly cooked steak, but it's all an illusion, or face reality? Tough choice.
It is a tough choice.
But the author, they bring up a really interesting point.
Okay.
About how our relationship with information has changed, like, drastically over time.
How so?
Well, they argue, like, a couple hundred years ago, this whole need to know idea was just, like, baked into everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Back in the 1800s, right? You didn't have instant access to news from around the globe.
Right.
A farmer wouldn't know about some, political scandal happening in some far-off city.
Right. Their world was their world.
Exactly. Their knowledge revolved around things that directly impacted them.
The weather, their crops, the local community. It's a far cry from our reality today.
It is. And you know what? They probably didn't know about, celebrity gossip or internet drama.
Right.
Life was simpler.
In a way.
In a way. But the author argues this shift towards constant connectivity and information overload, it's come with a price.
And that price is?
Anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
They say that this overload has created a populace of anxiety-ridden adults who are concerned with things that they cannot change and do not affect them.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. But I kind of see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
How often do you find yourself scrolling through news headlines, social media, and you're just overwhelmed by all the negativity, all the chaos?
All the time.
Even though it has nothing to do with your daily life.
Right.
Right?
I think that's a pretty universal experience these days.
It is. And the author isn't saying we should bury our heads in the sand and just, ignore everything.
Right.
But they are suggesting that maybe we become more mindful about the information we consume.
Be more selective.
Yeah. They even propose that maybe some information should be on a, need-to-know basis.
Interesting.
Especially when it comes to, understanding those complex systems that, make our modern world tick.
Give us an example.
Well, they use the example of economics.
Okay.
They say economics is completely useless to the average human being. They even go on to say it is almost completely useless to the people who are in charge of it.
Uh-huh.
It's a little tongue-in-cheek.
It is a bit tongue-in-cheek.
But I see what they're getting at.
Yeah.
Does knowing all the intricacies of, economic theory, does that actually help us in our daily lives?
Right.
Or is it just a lot of abstract information that creates more confusion than clarity?
I think that's a great question for our listeners.
Yeah.
What do you think out there?
Is there a line
Between staying informed, right, and just being overwhelmed with information that doesn't really serve us?
Yeah, it's a great question to ponder.
It is.
Now, the author does acknowledge the irony of their own position.
Oh, how so?
Well, they're a writer.
Right.
Actively sharing information with the world.
A walking contradiction.
Right, which, I think a lot of us can relate to that. We all have those moments where we're struggling with that balance.
Totally, yeah.
But here's the important point. The author isn't advocating for complete ignorance.
Right.
They still believe in the power of knowledge, especially when it comes to, self-improvement and personal growth.
So making a distinction between information that helps us, better our lives.
Right. Like learning a new skill or taking care of our health.
Okay.
Versus information that just feeds our curiosity about, gossip and the inner workings of things we can't control.
I see. So it's not about disconnecting from the world completely.
Right. It's about being more conscious about our information choices.
Yeah.
And seeking out knowledge that aligns with like our values and goals.
I love that. Choosing information that actually nourishes us.
Yeah. And it's not just about what we consume, but how we consume it too.
Oh, interesting point.
Like, I know I'm guilty of multitasking, you know, trying to read a news article while checking my email, listening to a podcast. And guess what? I don't remember anything.
Yeah, our brains just aren't wired for that kind of multitasking.
No, they're not.
So maybe another strategy is to just be more present.
Yeah.
When you are consuming information, set aside some dedicated time for reading, listening, or watching something that interests you.
Put away your phone.
Turn off those notifications.
Really focus.
And just absorb the information.
I think it's also important to remember that information isn't neutral.
How do you?
Well, everything we read, watch, listen to, it's shaped by someone else's perspective, their biases, their agenda.
That's a good point.
So it's really crucial to develop our critical thinking skills, you know?
Absolutely.
Learn how to evaluate information sources. Ask yourself, who created this? What's their motivation? Are they being balanced?
Don't just passively take it in. You got to engage with it critically.
It's like becoming an information detective, you know?
I love that analogy.
Looking for clues and piecing together the bigger picture.
Yeah, and you know what? Sometimes the most valuable information, it comes from stepping away from the screens altogether.
Oh, I completely agree.
And engaging with the real world around us. Go for a walk in nature, have a conversation with a friend, try a new activity.
Yeah, I love that.
Real world experiences. They give us a much needed break from that constant influx of digital information.
And that brings us to the heart of this whole deep dive, doesn't it?
What's that?
It's about recognizing that information is a powerful tool.
It is.
But like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
Absolutely.
It's up to us to wield that tool wisely.
Create a healthier relationship with knowledge.
Exactly. And with that in mind, let's shift gears and talk about a few practical strategies for, curating our information intake.
Okay.
And just creating a healthier relationship with knowledge in general.
Okay, so we've spent this deep dive looking at this idea.
That information can be a burden.
Yeah. Something we usually think of as a good thing, right?
Yeah. It's a bit mind-bending.
It is. It is. I mean, we've been talking about how too much information, it can lead to anxiety.
Right.
Disillusionment even.
Yeah.
And it can distract us from what really matters. But we can't just unplug completely.
We can't. We're constantly bombarded, whether we like it or not. So how do we find that balance?
Yeah, how do we become more mindful about what we let in?
That's the big question.
Well, one thing the author talks about is like focusing on information that is directly relevant.
Okay.
To your life, to your goals.
So like the things you're passionate about.
Exactly. The skills you want to develop, the problems you want to solve. Make a conscious effort to seek out information that helps you with those things.
It's like creating a personalized information diet almost.
Yes. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Just like we choose foods that nourish our bodies, we can choose information that nourishes our minds.
And just like with a healthy diet, sometimes it means cutting back on things that aren't so good for us. Maybe unsubscribing from those email newsletters, the ones that clog up your inbox with stuff you don't care about.
Oh, yeah.
Or limiting your time on social media if that makes you anxious.
I think a lot of us are guilty of that mindless scrolling, aren't we?
Yeah, and you get to the end and you're like, I don't even feel better. I feel worse.
Totally. So ask yourself, what kind of information leaves you feeling energized, inspired?
Okay.
Maybe it's listening to podcasts that challenge your thinking or reading books that expand your knowledge.
Right.
Whatever it is, prioritize those sources.
Prioritize what nourishes you. And it's not just what we consume, but how we consume it too, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I know I do this all the time, like multitasking, trying to read an article, check email, listen to a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, I don't even remember what I just read.
It's too much. Our brains aren't wired for that.
No, they're not. So be more present when you are consuming information.
Set aside that time.
Like dedicated time.
Put the phone away.
Turn off the notifications.
Focus.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to remember information isn't neutral.
What do you mean?
Well, everything we read, watch, listen to, it's shaped by someone's perspective, right?
Their biases, their agenda.
Exactly. So it's so important to develop those critical thinking skills.
For sure.
And learn how to, evaluate those sources.
Ask yourself who created this.
What's their motivation? Are they being balanced?
Yeah, don't just passively absorb it. Engage with it critically.
Be an information detective.
I love that. Sometimes the best information comes from just stepping away from the screens.
Oh, yeah.
Totally. Engaging with the real world. Go for a walk, have a conversation, try something new. Real world experiences, they give us that break we need.
I love that.
From that constant digital input.
And that kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it?
How so?
It's about recognizing that information, it is a powerful tool, but like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
Absolutely. It's up to us.
Yeah.
To wield it wisely.
Create a healthier relationship
with knowledge.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the burdens of information, we want to leave you with this. What steps can you take today?
Yeah. What one small change can you make?
To curate your information intake, right.
And just create a more balanced relationship with knowledge.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Share your experiences.
On social media, use the hashtag #InformationBurden.
And until next time, diving deep.
But be kind to your mind. Ever get